Hello there, friends at East Lake Church. My name is Doug Pagitt, and I'm the founding pastor of Solomon's Porch Christian Community in Minneapolis and the executive director of Vote Common Good and a friend of East Lake Church. It has been such a privilege to be with you so many times in the past, and I was really looking forward again to being with you today on Easter Sunday. But because of the coronavirus, we're all doing the right thing. We're staying at home and we're keeping our safe distance and we're caring for one another. So I'm here at home in my podcast studio, and all the best to you wherever it is that you find yourself. And I think of all those people who are in such difficult times now, and we think of you and how hard it can be to be stuck at home and to find yourself in this place. And I'm reminded of, in the midst of a crisis like this one, how important our artists are to us, that can give us a sense of beauty and a sense of connection and words to say and to sing and beauty to remind us that things will again return to that which is good. And so to all of you who are the makers and the creators, to the poets and the dreamers, to the musicians and the minstrels, thank you. I'm reminded of a song that my friend Ben Johnson, and one of the lead musicians in our community, wrote 10 years ago, that's called Rearrange. It's a song that I think captured then what we're all experiencing today, in this sense of feeling so rearranged. The opening line of the song goes like this: "Who we are now sits a little differently. It's not like the up fell down, but it sort of kind of did. And what we've said matters. And yes, you've changed from the smallest scattered remains. I care for you and have to rearrange. How I'm there for you, it might feel a little strange." So I do hope that you're all feeling cared for, that you're all feeling loved, and find those around you who can care for and who can love you. For me, it's been a real change in the last 3 weeks. I felt very rearranged. It was just weeks ago that I was traveling the country on a 50-state tour called the Faith, Hope, and Love for a Change on Election Day tour. And I went from living in a rolling revival commune to being back here at home in Minneapolis in my house with my wife and our daughter and our little grandson, which is really great, but it's such a change. And I've even decided to take on a no-shave quarantine project. And I'm guessing you too are living a life that you never expected, and frankly are probably having a hard time even understanding. So here we find ourselves stepping into this new reality, all of us together, yet sort of alone. It's kind of a perfect setting in which to talk about Easter, which I'm so glad to do because I love Easter. I kind of love everything about it, frankly. I love the universality of the story of Easter, the idea of new life and new birth, of rebirth or relife or restarting, resurgence. I love all of that. And I love that the Christian church decided nearly 2 millennia ago to put the celebration of this Easter story in alignment with what's happening in our land and on our planet, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. You might know that Easter is one of those movable holidays. It actually falls on, get a load of this, the first Sunday following the first full moon that occurs after the vernal equinox, March 21st. So here we have this seasonal date set by a pattern that involves the moon and the earth and the spin of the planet. And it's so great to have one of these holidays so rooted in these stories of nature and planet and people. And it allows us to access the universality of the story. This idea that things that seem to have died over winter are now coming back. Those things that seemed enclosed are now opening. Those things that felt like they were past have returned. That universality is one of the great parts of Easter. I just love it anywhere we find it in our society. There's this great song that Bruce Springsteen sings called Atlantic City. And the chorus is, "Everything dies, baby, that's a fact. But maybe everything that dies someday comes back. Put your makeup on, fix your hair up pretty, and meet me tonight in Atlantic City." This idea that we're just going to keep going in the midst of it all. Yeah, the universality of Easter is really just so powerful. I even frankly love the holiday part of Easter. I love the jelly beans and the Easter bunny and the dresses, and I love ham and deviled eggs. And I'm even good with peeps. I don't know where you sit on the great peep controversy around Easter, but I think they're kind of great. But truly, what I love most about Easter and what I want to talk to you about today is the power of the biblical narrative of Easter and how it can influence the time in which we live. You see, Easter is at the heart of the Jesus story, and it's a story that's both personal and political. The Bible as a religious text is not setting out nameless universal truths. It's a first name basis religious text. The power of its truth is found in the stories of people's lives and the happenings that they experience. I love this because it names names and names circumstance. It's a story of love and betrayal, of forgiveness and political power, death, lies, retribution, fear, and yet life and the call to life through it all. I've been doing a lot of work around the personal and the political nature of this story recently because of our political times. In the Gospels, it's Jesus who sits at the heart of the resurrection story, and Jesus is always engaging in religious and political systems. There's no separating the two. You see, the Jewish people of his day were living in a land that was controlled by the Romans and by their government and by their king, Caesar. And he was a political king. And it was in this context that Jesus was arrested and crucified as someone who was a threat to that king. And it is in this context that resurrection has its meaning. There are times when our faith calls us into opposition with our political leaders. That's been true in the first century all the way through to the 21st century. And I believe that we're living in one of those times now for many of us. In the first century, much like in our day, certain religious communities were wed to corrupt political leaders in order to gain power and attempt to have influence be in their favor. In the first century, it was temple leaders and the Sadducees with the likes of King Herod and Pontius Pilate and King Caesar. Today, I see that in the religious right and the Trump administration. The gospel accounts make it clear that we are to understand Jesus' execution and resurrection as political acts. He was a political prisoner, falsely accused and being executed as a way to extend political power through the most extreme form of messaging. The gospel makes it clear that Jesus was publicly crucified, that he was publicly hung on a cross to make a public and political statement, so that his followers would hear it, understand it, and they would shut up, they would be shut out, they would be shut down, and they would be shut into the grave. This is why the text makes it clear that those in charge of the execution wanted a sign above Jesus' head reading, King of the Jews. In other words, this is what will happen to your king if you rise up against our king. It was sort of the ultimate use of the all caps function. The early Christians always understood the execution and resurrection as setting a contrast between Jesus the Christ and Caesar the king. A crucifixion was the ultimate political messaging craft. And frankly, it still is. I've had the privilege of working to try to stop the death penalty in our country, and I have met men who were executed by the government. The death penalty remains in our day and in our country a political action designed to send messages, not as an act to protect public safety. And it's into this setting that the gospel speaks of resurrection. They call us to a choice. Do we embrace corrupt, brazen political power that use messaging as cruelty and lies to control, stifle, and shut down opponents? Or do we join the act of resistance, the act of love, the act of overcoming death, the act of resurrection, the act of saying no to that power of political death? The resurrection is the great, oh no, to the death penalty. It's the great response. It is a political protest. It is political resistance by giving an alternative story to power and propaganda and death. You can see it in the first century when the followers of Jesus said, well, King Caesar, King Herod, Pontius Pilate, you have no more power. Even your greatest act of crucifying, we can say no to it. This was, in the first century, the early resurrection, a response to the political and personal setting of the day. The reason the early followers of Jesus referred to him as king was meant to highlight this distinction of the corrupt political leadership of their day. The reason they met together to proclaim Jesus as Lord was to sit in contrast to Caesar, who demanded that people refer to him as Lord. What Jesus' story shows us is that even the one who is on God's side, even the one who is on the people's side, even the one who is calling for good for all, is the one who can be seen as the enemy to the political and religious leaders. The one who is understood as the Son of God and the brother of all of humanity is called the heretic, the blasphemer, by the religious leaders. I truly believe that that same dynamic is alive in our day. And I believe that a similar struggle is taking place for many of us in our country. I know that making statements like that can seem off-tune and off-putting to many. Many of us have been taught that the Easter story has little or nothing to do with the politics of our day. The resurrection of Jesus, we're told, is about a struggle that exists only in the heavenly realms, that it's all about the transaction of forgiveness of sin in some celestial economy of God. And as true and as powerful as all that is for personal transformation, it's only part of the story. But it's not really what the gospel tells us about. The gospels tell us of a real world choice that sets life-giving ways of Jesus as the alternative to those of King Herod and Pontius Pilate and King Caesar. It's one kingdom, the kingdom of Christ and love and resurrection, or the kingdom of power, judges, and death. Now, look, I'm not suggesting that there's a simple one-to-one correlation with Christians who hold to the resurrection story versus the Trump administration. And I'm not here to simply tell you who to vote for. It goes much deeper than that. The resurrection story, it calls us to open the lens of our minds and our eyes, to see what is more broadly happening in our world, the repeating patterns from the first century to the 21st century, the similarities of the use of messages of cruelty and power. They're yours to see. The cabal of religious leaders in corrupt and cruel political leaders coming together, that is yours to see. The use of messages of propaganda to stifle and kill opposing views, those are yours to see. And the story of the resurrection, it's also yours to see. The story of the resurrection comes not as the story of the acts of death and judgment and political power come. The resurrection story comes early in the morning on the first day, telling us that there's a new day dawning, that there's a new beginning, that there's a new way of political life together that leaves no one out, that includes everyone, making sure that everyone is involved and everyone has enough and no one has to be afraid. What I would call the story of the common good, or Jesus calls the kingdom of God. To be in the resurrection story, we notice that it was early in the morning that the women went to find that the tomb was empty. To believe the resurrection story, you have to believe the women. You have to take what they say as truth, gospel truth, that the power of death, isolation, even being put in the grave could not stop a rebirth of a new life of love and inclusion. The resurrection story calls us to raise our voices louder than ever in opposition to political powers that want to use that power to squelch. This is why the story goes on with those of the community of the faith of Jesus seeing him as Lord in opposition to Caesar, and as they grew in their passion and work, that the followers of Jesus were imprisoned for telling this story, for proclaiming the humane and political story of resurrection, for saying that God is on the side of the accused, and that God will not let his righteous one see decay in the grave. This is what they were mocked for. This is what they were saying when they proclaimed, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" This is why people over the centuries have been proclaiming, "Up from the grave he arose," or "He is risen, and he is risen indeed." That the power of that corrupt political system joining together with those religious narratives will not have the final say. This will be a community of resistance, a community of resurrection, and a community of love. So in this day, in my view, while I believe that we have corrupt and cruel political leaders who have called for unwavering honor and commitment from the religious community, and when I see religious leaders demanding that their followers fall in line with their devotion and support that political system, I see this age-old challenge that we find in the Gospels on that first Easter. Will we choose to believe? Will we choose love? Will we choose life? Will we choose the empty tomb over the cross? Will we choose Jesus, who embraces and includes all, over those who use power and messaging to divide and separate and mock the very children of God? This is our call on this Easter as we find ourselves in our home, not as if we are in some sort of grave in our home, but in a place that we know will protect and bring new life. And this is our call when these difficult times pass, and this will be our call in November, and this will be our call evermore, Easter to Easter. Amen.